The billionaire's family had gathered to bury him, and they had one simple rule: the maid and her daughter were not allowed anywhere near the family. But nobody expected what happened when the lawyer stood up and said, "Before we continue, Mr. Harrison instructed me to ask one person to come forward." Everyone looked around. Then the lawyer said a name that made the billionaire's wife turn completely pale: Sienna Brooks. Sienna froze. She was the poor black daughter of the maid. She had been humiliated in that very mansion just minutes earlier. Victoria Harrison, the billionaire's widow, immediately shouted, "She has no business being here." But the lawyer calmly opened a black folder. "Mrs. Harrison, I strongly suggest you let her stay." Victoria's face changed, because she knew something Sienna didn't. And when the lawyer finally revealed why the billionaire had secretly searched for Sienna before his death, and what he had left her in his will, the entire family was left speechless. Stay until the end, because the final revelation changes everything. And if you love stories where people who are underestimated finally discover their worth, subscribe now. To understand how Sienna Brooks ended up standing in that grand foyer, being screamed at by a woman who had never once looked at her with kindness, you have to go back 23 years, long before Sienna was born, long before the Harrison name meant private jets and skyscrapers with the family's letters carved into the stone. Grace Brooks was young then, working as household staff for a man who hadn't yet become a billionaire. Edward Harrison was ambitious, hardworking, and still building the empire that would one day make his name famous. He wasn't cold like the man his fortune would later turn him into being perceived as. He was thoughtful. He noticed things. He noticed Grace. What started as small conversations in the kitchen slowly became something neither of them expected. It wasn't about money, and it wasn't about status. Edward genuinely cared for Grace, and for a while in the quiet hours when the rest of the house was asleep, the two of them built something real. Then Grace found out she was pregnant. She never got the chance to tell Edward the way she wanted to, because Victoria found out first. Victoria Harrison was not yet the ice-cold woman she would become known as. But even then, she understood one thing clearly. Her marriage, her status, and her family's reputation could not survive a scandal like this one. She confronted Grace privately, made it clear that her job, her housing, and her entire future depended on disappearing quietly. She threatened her in ways that left no room for negotiation. Grace, young and terrified and with no family of her own to fall back on, did the only thing she could do. She left. Victoria made sure Edward believed the departure was Grace's choice entirely. She told him Grace had grown tired of the arrangement, had decided to move on with her life, wanted nothing more to do with him. Edward, devastated but proud, never chased after an explanation. He buried himself in building his company instead, and over the years that company grew into an empire. Grace raised her daughter alone. She named her Sienna, and she never told her the truth. Not because she didn't want to, but because every time she considered it, she remembered exactly how far Victoria was willing to go to protect her family's image. So Grace did the only thing she knew how to do. She worked. She found employment as a maid, and through a twist of fate that felt almost cruel, the family she ended up working for, years later, was the Harrison family. The very family her daughter's biological father had built. Sienna grew up watching her mother clean floors she would never be allowed to walk across as a guest, cook meals she would never be invited to sit down and eat, and endure the quiet, constant humiliation of a woman who treated her like she was invisible. Victoria never knew who Grace truly was to Edward, or so everyone believed. She simply saw a maid, someone beneath her, someone she could speak to however she pleased. She constantly reminded Grace of her place, humiliated her in front of dinner guests, gave her impossible tasks late at night, and made it painfully clear that in her mind, people like Grace existed to serve people like her. Sienna grew up smart, determined, and proud, despite everything. She watched her mother sacrifice her dignity year after year to keep a roof over their heads, and she promised herself that one day, things would be different. She had no idea just how different they were about to become. Then, 3 weeks ago, Edward Harrison died. The mansion, usually quiet and controlled, filled with family, lawyers, and staff preparing for the funeral. Victoria and her 3 adult children moved through the halls with the calm confidence of people who already knew exactly how much money was coming to them. They had spent their entire lives assuming the family fortune belonged to them by right, and Edward's death changed nothing about that assumption. Grace was ordered to keep working, even while grieving a man she had once loved, even while helping prepare a funeral for the father of her own daughter without anyone in the room knowing it. Sienna came to the mansion that day for one reason only. She wanted to be there for her mother. But the moment Victoria saw her, the humiliation began immediately. "This isn't a place for people like us," Victoria said coldly, loud enough for several guests to hear. "Grace has work to do. You shouldn't even be in this house." Sienna felt her whole body tense with the same anger she had swallowed 1,000 times throughout her childhood, watching her mother endure exactly this kind of cruelty. But this time, she wasn't a child anymore. "She's grieving too," Sienna said, stepping forward. "You don't get to treat her like she doesn't feel anything." Victoria's face twisted with fury. She turned to the nearest security guard and pointed directly at Sienna. "Get her out of my house. Now." The room went quiet as 2 guards approached Sienna. She felt every eye in that grand foyer land on her, felt the humiliation burn through her chest as she was walked toward the front doors like a criminal, in the very house her mother had spent decades cleaning. She didn't cry. She refused to give Victoria that satisfaction. She simply walked, head high, toward the exit, promising herself she would never set foot in that house again. And then, just as her hand touched the door, a voice stopped the entire room. "Nobody leaves. Mr. Harrison's final will is about to be read." Everyone turned. The family attorney, a composed older man carrying a black leather folder, stood at the center of the foyer. Victoria straightened immediately, her earlier anger replaced with something closer to satisfaction. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She gestured for her children to sit, confident that whatever the will said, the family fortune was about to become officially, permanently theirs. The attorney began reading. The first sections were exactly what everyone expected: property divisions, minor donations to charities Edward had supported, a few personal items left to old friends and business partners. Victoria barely listened, already mentally spending money that hadn't even been formally handed to her yet. Then the attorney reached a sealed section of the document, and his expression changed. He looked up, scanning the room. "Mr. Harrison left specific instructions regarding someone who isn't currently present in this gathering." Victoria's confident smile faltered slightly. "Is Miss Sienna Brooks here?" The entire room fell into stunned silence. Sienna, who had been halfway out the door, froze completely. She turned around slowly, certain she had misheard. Victoria shot to her feet, her face draining of color in a way that immediately caught the attention of everyone around her. "Why would my husband's lawyer need her?" The attorney didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at Sienna and asked her to come forward. Every step Sienna took back into that foyer felt heavier than the last. Guests parted to let her through, whispering amongst themselves, none of them understanding why a maid's daughter was being called forward during a billionaire's will reading. The attorney waited until she stood in front of him before he spoke again. Mr. Harrison spent the final months of his life searching for someone. A person he believed had been taken away from him more than 2 decades ago. Sienna shook her head, confused. "I don't understand. I've never even met Mr. Harrison." The attorney's expression softened slightly, the way someone's does when they are about to deliver news that will change a person's entire life. "Miss Brooks, Edward Harrison was your biological father." The room erupted, gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria's children stared at each other in disbelief. Somewhere near the back, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble floor, but nobody even turned to look. Victoria went completely pale, gripping the back of a chair to steady herself. Grace, who had been standing quietly near the kitchen entrance, dropped the tray she was carrying and broke down crying. Sienna turned toward her mother, her voice shaking. "Is this true?" Grace could barely speak through her tears, but she nodded. "I'm so sorry, baby. I wanted to protect you. I never wanted you to grow up in the middle of all this." Sienna felt the ground shift beneath her entire understanding of her life. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her mother, about the family she had spent years serving without ever truly seeing, collapsed and rebuilt itself in a matter of seconds. The attorney gave the room a moment before continuing, his voice steady and clear. Several months before his passing, Mr. Harrison discovered an old photograph among his late mother's belongings. It showed a young woman holding a newborn baby. That woman was Grace Brooks. That baby was Sienna. He explained that Edward had begun quietly investigating, uncovering old letters he had once written to Grace that were never delivered, evidence that someone within his own household had deliberately intercepted his attempts to reach her years earlier. Edward ordered a private DNA test to confirm what he already suspected in his heart. The results were undeniable. Sienna was his daughter. He intended to introduce her to the family publicly, to make things right after decades of separation he never chose. But his health declined faster than anyone expected, and he passed away before he ever got the chance. So he made sure his final wishes would speak for him instead. The attorney opened the folder wider. Mr. Harrison's will leave Sienna Brooks his entire personal fortune, including all private assets, properties, and accounts held outside the company. Victoria's children shifted uncomfortably, exchanging tense glances, already recalculating what remained for them. But the attorney wasn't finished. In addition, Mr. Harrison has left Miss Brooks 51% controlling ownership of Harrison Enterprises. The room went utterly silent. Sienna wasn't simply an heir receiving a portion of the family's wealth. She now controlled the entire company, the empire Edward had spent his life building, the one Victoria and her children had always assumed belonged to them by birthright. Victoria's shock quickly twisted into fury. This is absurd. I will not accept this. That woman manipulated my husband. Her daughter is nothing but an opportunist who saw an old, dying man and took advantage of him. She turned toward the attorney, her voice rising. I have a document. Evidence that will destroy this ridiculous claim entirely. A murmur spread through the room. Several relatives leaned forward, sensing the possibility that everything might reverse itself in Victoria's favor after all. But the attorney remained completely calm. Mrs. Harrison, before you present anything, I have something you should see first. He reached into his folder and produced a second, thinner document. Would you like me to show everyone what Mr. Harrison discovered about you before his death? Victoria froze. The confidence drained from her face in an instant. The attorney continued without waiting for her permission. Mr. Harrison learned, in his final months, that you had known about Sienna's true identity for years. He discovered that you personally intercepted letters he attempted to send to Grace after their separation. He also found records showing that you paid a private investigator to monitor Grace and Sienna's whereabouts for over a decade, ensuring they never crossed paths with this family. Gasps spread through the room once again, this time directed entirely at Victoria. She stood frozen, unable to form a response, as the weight of 2 decades of carefully hidden secrets came crashing down in front of everyone she had spent her life trying to impress. The attorney set the folder down gently. There's one more thing, he said quietly. Before he passed, Mr. Harrison recorded a final message. He asked that it be played today in this room in front of the entire family. He pressed a small remote, and Edward Harrison's voice filled the silent foyer, calm and steady, carrying the weight of a man who had made peace with everything he could no longer change. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and the truth is finally out. I want you all to know that I don't say any of this with anger. I say it with regret. I regret not protecting Grace when I had the chance. I regret every year I lost with my daughter because I trusted the wrong person to be honest with me. I cannot undo those years, but I can make one final decision that reflects who I truly wanted to be, not who my name and my money turned me into. There was a pause, and then his voice continued, steadier than before. I am leaving my company and my fortune to Sienna, not because she is poor, and not simply because she is my daughter, but because she is the only person in this family who never once believed she was entitled to anything from me. The rest of you spent years assuming this money belonged to you simply by being born into it. Sienna spent her life earning everything through her own hands, without ever knowing what she was actually owed. The people who believed they deserved my fortune are about to learn that money cannot buy character. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. Victoria's children stared at their mother, the realization sinking in that Edward had known about her betrayal, had known about their years of entitled assumption, and had chosen, in his final act, to reward the one person who had never asked for anything. Victoria sank into a chair, her composure completely shattered for the first time anyone in that family had ever witnessed. In the months that followed, Sienna could have easily become exactly the kind of person who had humiliated her mother for years. She had the power now. She had the money, the company, the influence to destroy anyone who had ever looked down on her. She chose a different path. She made sure Grace never had to work another day in her life, giving her enough to retire permanently and comfortably. She created a foundation in her father's name, one dedicated to supporting housing and education for domestic workers and their children, families who had spent their lives being treated the way her mother once was. She also opened an internal investigation into Harrison Enterprises, uncovering that Victoria's children had spent years quietly siphoning company funds into private accounts, believing no one would ever question them. Sienna removed each of them from their executive positions, not out of cruelty, but because a company built on her father's legacy deserved leadership with integrity. But when it came to Victoria herself, Sienna held back. "I could treat you exactly the way you treated my mother," Sienna told her, standing calmly in the same foyer where she had once been dragged toward the exit. "But I won't. You taught me exactly what kind of person I never want to become." Victoria said nothing. There was nothing left for her to say. Months later, Sienna returned to the Harrison mansion, this time walking through the front doors as their rightful owner. Years earlier, she had been told she wasn't good enough to enter through those same doors. Now they opened for her without hesitation. She wore something elegant but simple, and beside her walked her mother. The household staff no longer referred to Grace as the maid. They called her Mrs. Brooks, because Sienna made absolutely certain everyone in that house understood her mother's dignity, once and for all. Sienna paused just inside the entrance, looking around at the grand foyer that had once been the site of her deepest humiliation. She remembered every cold word Victoria had ever spoken to her mother, every order given without a hint of respect, every moment she had watched Grace shrink herself just to keep a roof over their heads. Then she turned to her mother and said quietly, "We don't have to prove that we belong here anymore, Mom." Grace smiled through tears, taking her daughter's hand. They walked forward together, into a home that finally, truly belonged to them. People can spend years judging you by the uniform you wear, the house you live in, or the money in your bank account. But they never know the story being written behind the scenes. Sometimes the person they treat like nobody is the very person whose name has been waiting all along to change everything. Let me know in the comments, do you think Sienna should have forgiven Victoria completely, or was holding back the right choice? And subscribe, because the next story might just be even more unforgettable than this one.